Welcome to Voice of the Nation. I'm Chanchai Wong. One of the crises that have been going on in the world for a very long time is refugee crisis. As more people must flee their homes, their countries, to survive from violence and oppression or from war. And they also face discrimination in new countries as if they were criminals or someone dangerous. But the fact is that they just want somewhere safe to start their new life. So, what can we do to help with this crisis? And joining us today is Mrs. Morgan Roosevelt Emery, Associate External Relations Officer from UNHCR Thailand. Welcome, Ms. Roosevelt Emery, to our program.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for having me.
Hi, good evening. Uh, Let me first start by asking you that I understand that refugee crisis is getting worse after the unexpected war in Ukraine broke out. Can you explain how serious this crisis is right now?
So, if I just start from the global perspective, because the number of people forced to flee their home has increased every year since the past decade, and then now stands at the highest level since records began. UNHCR actually predicted last year in the global trend report that forced displacement will exceed 100 million people. The question was not if it was going to happen, but rather when, and the when is actually now. 2021 was marked by new conflict and a flare-up in existing conflict. This was before the war in Ukraine. And now Ukraine is one of the largest and fastest forced displacement crises since World War II. One third of Ukrainians have been forced to flee their home. This comes on top of the million of people who were already in need of humanitarian assistance in the eastern part of the country, which has been experiencing armed conflict for the past 8 years. Within Ukraine, there is about 7.1 million people that remain internally displaced by the war, and about 15 million that are estimated in urgent need of humanitarian assistance. Regarding the movement outside of Ukraine, UNHCR estimates that there is about 4.8 million refugees present across Europe. So inside Ukraine, many people who are trapped are unable to meet their basic needs, including food, water, and medicine. The delivery of life-saving aid remains challenging with the lack of safe humanitarian access in areas where intense hostilities are ongoing. UNHCR and partners continue to actually coordinate the response with the interagency coordination mechanism.
So this is the first time in history that number of refugees around the world exceeds 100 million people, right?
So it's 100 million people who have been displaced. That includes asylum seeker, refugee, and internally displaced people. So refugees are individuals that have crossed an international border, but you can be displaced within your country of origin because of conflict and war. That's the number, the figure I mentioned of about 7 million within Ukraine, for instance.
Okay. And do you have the number like which continent or which area, which countries have the most refugees? And or maybe the number is accelerating very fast.
It is on top of my head. I wouldn't. I mean, you have the main crisis such as Syria in Middle East that has moved million of people, and Ukraine is quite of an exceptional case scenario at the moment. Um, you actually, I don't. I would say Syria has been, I think, with over 5 million
Okay.
also refugees.
Okay.
I should double
And
check that.
and for this year, I think most people are very worried about Ukraine refugees. Now, Russia have pulled their troops out of Kiev and concentrate their fighting in the eastern part of the countries. Does this make the Ukrainian that fled to Poland or Romania or other neighbor countries feel safer and return to their hometown in Ukraine? Or do they still worry that the Russian troop might come back and attack again?
So the situation in Ukraine is still quite unstable. Indeed, UNHCR has observed movement back to Ukraine. The authorities in Ukraine and neighboring countries have reported that more than 2.3 million people have gone back since February 28th. However, the situation is still very fluid, and it's too early to draw any conclusion regarding concrete trend. Considering how volatile also the situation is, UNHCR cautioned that those movements might not be sustainable at this point. We do not know what's going to happen in the near future. And UNHCR does hope that the war would like end soon, and that all who wish to return would be able to do so.
Okay, and may I ask you that how is the cooperation of the neighbor country with Ukraine, like Poland, Romania, and Hungary? I think that they provide quite a lot of support for Ukrainian refugees.
Yes, this has been quite of the positive, I mean, in terms of the refugee crisis, the positive outcome that we've seen. Like neighboring countries have like strengthened the coordination mechanism. They have opened the doors. They have like replied to the needs of the refugee crossing. So UNHCR does welcome very much what neighboring countries have done to welcome refugee in dire need of humanitarian assistance.
Okay, and closer to Thailand, what is the current situation of people fleeing from Myanmar to Thailand?
So the situation in Myanmar is one of the main refugee crises also globally. To understand a little bit more our like operational context, we need to differentiate a protracted refugee situation and an emergency situation. A protracted for UNHCR means that refugees have been in displacement for over 5 years, and you have over 25,000 people in displacement. In the case of Thailand, for instance, there is the 9 temporary shelters along the border that have received refugees during the during the mid 80s. And those are, for instance, the protracted refugee situation. The Royal Thai government like manages the 9 refugee camp along the border. UNHCR focus on assistance with protection, and there is a consortium of INGOs that provide material assistance to these refugees. Then, when we talk of emergencies such as Ukraine, for instance, it's all of the sudden it happened. It sparks movement. That happened also in Myanmar with the 2021 February coup last year, which like general violence and the resurgence of clashes between the military and the ethnic armed group have created a context that people have been forced to flee. So in Myanmar, for instance, last week, the number of 700,000 internally displaced people have been reached. And in terms of refugee outflow, it's about 40,000 that are now in India. And in Thailand, we have had several movement of influx of about 20,000 since February 2021. But refugees have returned to Myanmar after the fighting have subsided. So this is two different situations, for instance, for Myanmar with the new arrival after the 2021 February coup.
Okay. It's quite sad to hear that as we are living in 2022 with all the technological advance and all the money that we have, we still have a refugee crisis around the world, and it seems like to getting worse and worse every year. And can I ask you that as the result of world economy, war and conflict in many countries in the past 2 years, do you find it challenging in terms of fundraising support from the public to enable UNHCR to provide shelter, food, water, medical care, and other life-saving assistance to refugees?
So UNHCR relies almost entirely on voluntary contribution. So yes, fundraising has been tough. About 85% of our budget comes from like individual government and the European Union, and it's about 11% that comes from like individual, like you and me, just giving money, but also the private sector, that's foundation, corporation, and so on. However, despite all those like generous donation we receive, we only get about half of what we need for the response. And in the context of the pandemic, actually the need of the refugee have been increased. I mean, they have entered like extremely dire living condition because of lockdown and restriction and so on, and limited access to livelihood. So in that sense, UNHCR has scaled up our work to keep the refugees and the internally displaced safe. However, we still need a lot of assistance because, I mean, the international community has shown extreme solidarity globally for COVID-19 appeal. However, the need have increased. So it remains as challenging as it used to be. So about like if you think about the refugee crisis, it's about 1% of the global number of human on the planet that is being displaced. So every donation makes a difference, because we do ensure that most of the all the donation goes to serve the refugees. And this is for when we talk about protection with UNHCR, it's provision of food, shelter, medical treatment, education, all of those that are being basic services. As you mentioned, all those technologies are available, and it's also services that when you have access to this, you take it for granted. However, it is as the minimum of human dignity to have those. So in Thailand, for instance, there is several channel that you can support UNHCR with, whether by donation, but also participating to our campaign and so on.
So we would like to also express our appreciation to those good-hearted people around the world who make a life of refugee around the world a little bit better and safer. And for a long-term solution, we probably cannot rely on fundraising and donation alone. So what do you think is the long-term solution for refugee crisis?
So in terms of assistance to the refugee, UNHCR has a 3 set of solutions that we support refugee with. It's voluntary repatriation, local integration, or resettlement to a third country in situation where it's really impossible for the person to either go back home or remain in the country where they're being hosted. In terms of looking at the trend in 2021, we have seen some positive outcome with long-lasting solution. For return, for instance, in 2021, it's about 430,000 people that were able to go home safely in dignity, which is about a 71% increase compared to the previous year. In this number, it's about 2/3 that returned to South Sudan, which is another refugee crisis. Despite these progresses I'm mentioning, we are still talking about only 2% of the world refugees. When it comes to resettlement, which is a very much one of the last solution, and it's only 1% of the refugees globally that are getting resettled, but also in the current context, we're seeing less and less spot offered for resettlement. However, for refugees that cannot stay in the country of asylum or go back home, we need far more resettlement places to allow them to rebuild their life in a new country. And finally, I talked about local integration. In 2021, we have seen also very good progress. It estimated that 50,000 refugees from 161 countries have been naturalized in 23 host countries, which is about a 2/3 increase compared to 2020, and actually brings us back to a pre-pandemic level. It was about 50,000 in 2019. And finally, the theme, so this year we're celebrating the World Refugee on the 20th of June. And we talk about access to asylum and safety, and that has been a positive progress also in 2021. We have been able to see more asylum seekers getting access to 121 countries globally, which compared to 108 countries at the beginning of 2021.
Okay. And I think it's also very important for ordinary people to have the correct understanding, right attitude toward refugees. Can I ask you that what is the most misconception that people often thinking about refugees?
That's an easy one. Refugee being perceived as migrants. People think that refugee make the choice to leave their place
Okay.
of home, that it's something that can be economically driven, that they come for jobs and so on. However, according to the international law, the definition of a refugee is someone who has to flee their home because of fear of persecution, of violence, of conflict. A refugee is a person that has no choice. If they stay home, they might be at risk of getting injured, getting harmed, getting killed. And so the matter of crossing the border and seeking asylum in another country, it's not a decision, it's different than a migrant. A migrant is someone that if they stay in their country of origin, they have a state protection. A refugee is being deprived from that state protection.
Okay, so migrant is like they make their choice to move to another country for economic opportunity.
Yeah.
But for refugee, it's like they being forced to leave their home or their countries, or they might or their life might be in danger.
Completely.
Okay, and this week, UNHCR and partner is organizing the 11th Refugee Film Festival at Paragon Cineplex. Can you tell us about the objective of this film festival? What is it that you are trying to achieve through the film festival?
So the film festival is being organized in the context of the World Refugee Day. So World Refugee Day is an international day to honor the resilience and the strength of the refugee globally, but also to build empathy and understanding about their plight and to recognize what we can do to help them and support them to rebuild their life. So this year, indeed, in Thailand, we have partnered with embassies, the private sector, to organize the 11th Refugee Film Festival, which the main objective is providing. So we do share we screen those award-winning movies and documentary, but that gives an insight into the lives of refugees. It also humanize their plight. We kind of want to raise awareness about why refugees happens to be in this situation, how do they feel, what is the situation they have to go through, and it's also to foster solidarity among the general public, that all sector together we need to address the cause of forced displacement, because it is a collective responsibility for us to ensure that people that have been forced to flee have access to solution and support.
And I think that movie is a very powerful tool to tell a story so that the audience can have a better understanding about the life of refugees. And I think that this film festival, there are 5 movies to choose, right?
Yeah.
Have you seen any movie from the festival?
Yeah, so I did. I was and I was also among the judging committee for the pastor for the Refugee Film Festival.
Okay.
So yeah,
And which movie? So you have seen all 5 movies?
yes, I did. That was my
Okay.
my homework.
Can you tell us which movie is your favorite and why?
um, my favorite one. I mean, I liked the movie Flee. That was about an Afghani refugee that fled Afghanistan during the 1980s.
Okay.
But I had a soft spot for Captain of Zaatri. So I was based also in Jordan for a long time. So I happen to have been working in Zaatri refugee camp in Jordan. The Zaatri refugee camp is for the Syrian refugee response. So the story of the movie, it's 2 kids, Mahmoud and Fauzi, who are a soccer player and kind of dream to become professional soccer players. And at some point, there is a tournament being organized in Qatar, and they get to travel to Qatar to play a proper tournament. And I find that the movie is lovely in a sense that it shows that if you give opportunities to refugees and they can seize it, they make the best out of it. But I think that it's even more striking how eloquent one of the kids. So they're 2 kids. They might be 15 or 17 years old. But Mahmoud, one of the kids. So spoiler alert. I'm sorry for that,
Okay.
but it's just a
No.
quote at the end of the movie. They have a press conference and they're making a statement. And he does say something very powerful about his own experience as a refugee, because he says since I'm a kid, I've become a refugee and I've been deprived of opportunities, but I haven't been deprived from my dreams. And he was refugee needs opportunities for education, medical treatment, and sport. And he concludes with a very powerful sentence, being all a refugee need is an opportunity, not pity. And I found it was very well said, in a sense that they are often victimized, being a bit deprived of any sort of agency. However, they are still individual and people like us. It just happened that they have ended up in a situation that absolutely terrifying, and they had to flee their home country.
That is a very good point that you said that most refugees, what they actually want is opportunity, not pity. Can you tell us if someone is interested to see the movie at this festival, how can they book the tickets?
Sure. So the film festival is being held between the 17th and the 20th of June at Paragon Cineplex, and it's open to everyone and it's free. But you do need to sign up online to book a seat because there is limited spaces in the room. And so for that, you can just go we have a registration link available on UNHCR Thailand webpage. And we have also at Siam Paragon, if you come around, we have other activities such as a showcase of a refugee housing unit. So you can have an idea of how it looks. Those shelter we had put in place actually in Jordan, for instance. And there is a tuk-tuk painting activity to support the refugees with the plane toys. And so those two activities would be at Siam Paragon also on the 18th of June. Everything is available on our webpage.
Okay. May I ask how long have you been working with UNHCR?
Unit of on and off, maybe 5 years, 4 years. I've not consistent, but I worked with UNHCR in Sudan for a few months, and also before coming to Thailand, I was based in Burundi, which is a very small country next to Kenya and Rwanda, for 2 years and a half, and now over a year in Thailand.
Okay, and from your own experience with refugees, what are the things that you can say about what are the things that refugees need the most from people around the world?
So usually, I would always say it's better to just ask them. Usually, they can be the most well placed to just tell you. But from a general responsibility point of view, as social civil society, there is few things that you can do to support refugees. It can be also sometimes it can be as simple as just volunteering with a local organization. Any kind of skills that you have, you might support refugees with teaching a language or craft. You can also become a supporter and advocate with UNHCR and share on social media to raise awareness, but inform, as you mentioned earlier, elderlies and so on, who are a little bit less informed, who can be a bit more into the stigma and stereotypes about the refugees. So it's important to also educate and share information. And then it can be also, you can set up your own fundraising activity to fund money for any sort of initiative that for the refugees. And that actually UNHCR does support coordination and so on if you want to streamline your funding to the refugee cause. And finally, you can just go on our website, click donate. It's an easy one, but it is a one that does matter and makes a difference, because every donation, as little as it is, makes a difference in refugee lives.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Lucille Emery, for talking with us today. And we all hope that refugee crisis will becoming resolved as the years go by, and that their life could be safer and better. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Bye.
And that's all for Voice of the Nation today. Thank you for staying with us.